Welcome in to another episode of the Barnes on Bama podcast. I'm your host, Owen Barnes, and we have some games to discuss. First things first, Alabama has made the Sweet 16. So we're going to talk about it. Alabama basketball makes their fourth Sweet 16 in 5 years, third consecutive. This is the first time since Wimp Sanderson that Alabama's been able to accomplish this. Just an absolute incredible accomplishment. Obviously, you're a 2 seed, so it is something that you came into this tournament expecting. But obviously, you're glad to actually accomplish that because not all 2 seeds did make it to this point. Obviously, St. John's losing to Arkansas. Upsets happen in this tournament, so you have to take everything. Can't take anything for granted. You have to be happy with what you've gotten, right? So we're going to talk about both of those games that got us to the Sweet 16, the win over Robert Morris and the win over St. Mary's. Then we will discuss the BYU game. Just a heads up, I am not going to talk about the Arizona and Duke game. My plan is after the game on Thursday night, Friday or late Thursday night, I'm going to record an episode either breaking down a win or a loss to BYU, and if we win, I will break down the matchup and who we're going to be facing, right? So that episode will come out on Friday in advance of the game that's going to be happening on Saturday. So just a heads up, I'm not going to talk about the other side of our bracket because I do want to wait to actually be able to talk about whoever that team actually is. So let's talk about the games that have happened so far, and then we'll talk about BYU. I'll give a prediction, and then we'll get out of here. So Alabama gets their first matchup. Their first matchup was against Robert Morris, and Robert Morris showed to be a much more talented team than I think a lot of people gave them credit for. Robert Morris per KenPom was like 140. Obviously, that's not the best matchup for them, but they did show a lot of fight, right? When you see a lot of these teams that have a lower depth amount, right? They're only playing 6, 7 guys. You really worry about them when they play against Alabama, especially when they're not a team that can slow down the tempo, right? St. Mary's had that same thing, but you thought, if they were able to control the pace, maybe 7 guys isn't as big of an issue. With Robert Morris, you immediately feel like this could be a problem, right? Robert Morris really only plays 6 guys in this game, right? They have a 7th guy that comes in because they had 2 guys foul out, but they, played 6 guys for the majority of this game. And to their credit, they looked great. Robert Morris took advantage of Alabama's lackluster performance. Alabama planned to not play Grant Nelson in this game. Grant Nelson hurt his knee in the Florida game. It turned out it was a patella tendon injury, and Alabama was going to sit him for the entire Robert Morris game, as well as, to get him ready for potentially a St. Mary's matchup. It felt like to me, and it's something that I said to multiple people, it felt like that the team thought that Alabama had it in the bag because Grant Nelson was sitting, right? Alabama had an early lead. They jumped onto Robert Morris pretty early in this game. Started out on a 14-6 score. Then they were up 28-8. And it really looked like Alabama may just run away with it. But then by halftime, it's 40-36. Robert Morris actually takes the lead at one point in this game, goes 65-64. Grant Nelson's put in around that time. Then Alabama goes on an 11-1 run and ends up softening the game away at the end. Alabama, does end up, winning. I wouldn't call it comfortably, but toward the end they did, get out to a lead that you didn't stress toward the very end. But 7-8 minutes to go in this game, and Robert Morris was in the lead. When you talk about these matchups in March Madness, the big thing is that you have to put away the smaller teams late. Because if you give them the opportunity to think they have a chance, the closer it gets, the crowd gets involved. The crowd's going to be cheering on the underdog. The players get to thinking, hey, we really can do this. They come into the game obviously thinking they can win, but when they're up late or very close late, they actually start believing it, not just saying it. So that's something that you kind of have to worry about when you look at March Madness. To Alabama's credit, they were able to kind of finish this game off, but it really exposed a few things with Alabama, and it was something that we knew had to be fixed for the St. Mary's game just due to some of the issues that we saw in this game. First things first, Robert Morris had 16 offensive rebounds. We talk about how good of an offensive rebounding team Alabama is at times. Alabama's out offensive rebounded Texas A&M. They out offensive rebounded Houston. Mississippi State, plenty of these teams that do a good job at it. But at times this season, Alabama has had issues with this, right? There have been games where they go long stretches and they don't get an offensive rebound, or, they play down to their competition. It's something that's really concerned us at long stretches for this season. It was something that absolutely happened in this game. Alabama gets just 5 offensive rebounds, and Grant Nelson has one of them in his 7 minutes. Robert Morris has, a single guy with 6, another guy with 5. Robert Morris, really their players felt like they wanted it more than us. Clearly, it looked like Robert Morris was locked in and that their players, like I said, truly just wanted it more. Marion Dickinson for them, has 25 points, the Cleveland native. They talked about that a lot. The other thing with Robert Morris, they're only about 2 hours away from Cleveland where this game was played, so they had substantially more fans in attendance. I had a couple of friends that were at the game. They said that the crowd was obviously very pro Robert Morris. That's going to be the case when you're talking about a mid-major, but it was even more prevalent when you hear that Robert Morris is only 2 hours away. So this is, something that a ton of their fans, come over to the game. It just ended up being a game that was much more difficult than Alabama wanted it to be. You did get some good play out of Mohamed Diabate in this game. He ends up with 18 and 10. Cliff Amori, was an absolute animal in this game, and that's something we're going to talk about for the St. Mary's game as well. But these two games, it really felt like Alabama's putting a lot of emphasis on the alley-oop and the roll, the strong roll to the basket. Cliff was not used as much in alley-oop during the season. I know Nate talked about it in some press conferences that it was something that they wished that we were getting more of, and it's something that they definitely have put an emphasis on for this tournament. Obviously, a super efficient shot. Cliff does a great job finishing. He goes 8 of 8. Mohamed Diabate goes 6 of 8. Both super efficient. Mark Sears does not shoot well from the 3-point line, but does shoot well from the floor. 4 of 7, 11 of 13 from the 3-point line, from the free throw line. Also gets 10 assists, part of that throwing those alley-oops, part of that just, facilitating the offense. So Mark Sears and Mo both get double-doubles in this game. So, ends up being an okay game, but it's definitely not the start to a tournament that you want. I kind of looked at it as, at least you survive in advance. Maybe it wakes the team up. You really understand, hey, if you lose, you go home. And, hopefully it's going to wake us up for that next matchup, right? That's how I looked at the Robert Morris game. I know some people were much more concerned. Alabama shoots just 28% from the 3-point line. They miss 8 free throws. There were definitely some problems that we had in that game, but I was not super concerned with what I saw in that Robert Morris game. There were definitely some things that I was, wanting to see fixed, but I wouldn't say that they were unfixable. A couple of the things, like I said, the big one for me is it really felt like us not starting Grant Nelson, or not planning on not playing Grant Nelson, let's say that, because I fully expect us not to start him. But the idea that he was not going to play in this game at all really almost felt like told the team, hey, we already won this. And that was something that definitely was an issue for me. You hoped that the team would have the maturity that even though he's not going to play, you're still going to play your hardest, even without putting him in. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen. When Grant goes in, the team plays to a completely different level. It's very clear how important he was to us as a team. He ends up getting just 5 points, but it was super important, the points that he got. Gets 3 rebounds in the short minutes he's in, and, makes a real difference on the floor. Alabama ends up winning the game, and you survive in advance, and you move on to St. Mary's, and ends up coming back from a double-digit deficit to knock off Vanderbilt. So then we move to the St. Mary's game, and for those of you that watched the original preview or read my thread talking about this game, honestly, this game happened exactly how I thought. My prediction for this game on the thread was 78-69. This game was 78-66 with 45 seconds left. So I think that my prediction and how I thought this game was going to take place was honestly very accurate. Alabama was able to control the pace in this one. St. Mary's had not given up 80 points really at all in the last 5 years. I believe it was 2022 the last time they gave up 80 points. Alabama gets to 80. Alabama also gets to 70 possessions, a number that they had only given up like once this season. Just a really, Alabama was able to control the pace, but as Nate has talked about it many times this season, Alabama does not control pace by gambling on defense, right? Alabama controls pace by getting the ball out and running on offense. And if you notice, there was a couple of moments during this game where they talked about the fact that Alabama had not turned St. Mary's over at all in the first half, right? The first half ends, Alabama has 0 turnovers against St. Mary's. St. Mary's finishes with 6 turnovers, so Alabama does a much better job in the second half for it. But in the first half, they had 0 turnovers, and Alabama still was leading the fast break points. And Alabama had 11 turnovers, right? Alabama finishes with 11 turnovers in this game. St. Mary's has 6. Alabama was leading the fast break points, and it was all off of rebounds. Alabama did an incredible job of this game of when they got the defensive rebound to run with the basketball, or even off a make, run with the basketball. That was, we knew was going to be a focus point of this game. Nate Oates in his press conference said it 20 or 30 times, like, we have to rebound, we have to rebound. They talked about St. Mary's sending guys to the glass. This was an incredibly good rebounding team, St. Mary's. They were top 10 in offensive and defensive rebounding, and it had to be the focus point of the game. As Nate said, you're not going to blank St. Mary's. They were going to get their rebounds, but you had to fight and had to get the rebounds you could. And Alabama ends up getting 33 defensive rebounds, and those defensive rebounds led to a lot of points because Alabama was able to get out and run, get ahead of the defense, and score on a non-set defense, and it was a huge key to this game. Again, Alabama used the pick and roll with Grant Nelson and with Cliff Amore. Grant Nelson starts in this game, played great. Both guys had really, really big roles, him and Cliff, from a alley-oop perspective. Cliff had a couple of just absolutely jaw-dropping alley-oops. The one that we were watching in Heat, I was watching with Hunter and a bunch of other guys there, and Mark throws one up, and Cliff just does a reverse alley-oop. Just absolutely insane. We were curious where the ball was even going because it just kind of felt like Mark almost had lost it and just kind of put it up, and Cliff went up and got it. There was another one that it looked like the alley-oop was going to Jaron. Cliff steals it from him midair and goes for it. And then the one that's kind of been shown around on Twitter and a lot of videos been taken, LeBaron Fallon in transition hits Grant, where he hits an alley-oop over 2 guys, right? So Alabama, was obviously utilizing the alley-oop, utilizing some of the guards in transition to take as much advantage as they could. Alabama had a lot of success with this. This was the best offense that Alabama had, especially for St. Mary's, was they were able to score quickly, especially off of the rebound, and like I said, score on a non-set defense. Because when St. Mary's had their defense set, at times they were doing a good job forcing turnovers from Alabama and getting us into not doing, our style of basketball. But then at other moments, Alabama did a very good job. St. Mary's ran us off the three-point line. We only took 17 three-pointers in this game, made just 7. St. Mary's actually took 14, so St. Mary's almost took as many three-pointers as we did, but it was because Alabama was content with scoring around the basket and scoring in transition and then from the free throw line, right? Alabama ends up making 15 free throws, the same as St. Mary's does, but like I said, the transition buckets was really the difference in this game, and Alabama is able to have a lot of success because of that. I want to say credit to Grant Nelson. He gets 3 offensive rebounds. Credit to Cliff Amore. He gets 3 defensive rebounds. Cliff has another double-double in this game. Absolute credit to him. I thought that Muhammad Diabate had another good game. I thought that Jaron Stevenson at moments had a decent game. I thought Aiden Holloway had a good game. In his minutes, I thought Darion Reed played very well. I thought that in general, Alabama played a pretty good game. It really felt like Mark Sears at moments was very successful against them, and at moments it felt like he was forcing it a little too much. He did have some foul trouble, and when he went out, Aiden and LeBaron did a very good job keeping the offense rolling. Another guy that we have to talk about just because of how well he shot the basketball was Chris Youngblood. Chris talked about how in the Robert Morris game, he went 1 of 5, and he was thinking, for any of you that saw some of the early games as well as the SEC tournament, he had been wearing glasses post the Auburn game because of getting hit in the face. And apparently he said that he had been having to adjust them. They were getting smudges on him, and he shot very poorly in that Robert Morris game, 1 of 5, as I mentioned. And Chris Youngblood comes out and goes 3 of 3 from the three-point line, hits an actual bank from the baseline off the side corner of the backboard that was just an absolutely insane shot. Really looked like the Chris Youngblood that we expect. Much more comfortable out there. It definitely, based on his comments and such, it really feels like the glasses were affecting him in some way, whether it would be psychologically or, just inability to see the same if there's smudges and stuff. So I really thought that it was great seeing him like that. He played, like I said, very, very good in this game, plays 24 minutes. The credit to Alabama in this game is obviously this is a tournament that you're going to have a little bit of extra rest, but Alabama doesn't play a single guy over 28 minutes. And when you think about Alabama basketball and how much we have played some guys at times during the season, having just 2 guys play 28 minutes in this game, awesome, right? Very, very good to see that minutes load be under 30 when you're playing back-to-back-to-back games and having a long stretch run against really good teams in this tournament, right? So I'm very happy about seeing that. I thought that the minutes that each guy played was great. I thought it was cool to see natives take the time out to get Max Charnowski in as well as their backups in. Really cool just to get guys into a March Madness game. I thought really classy. Like I said, Alabama's able to hold them at arm's length. Alabama wins by 14, and Alabama puts up the most points that St. Mary's has given up since 2022. So was very, very happy with what I saw in that game. And then finally, we move to the BYU game. BYU makes the Sweet 16 after beating VCU by 9, and then Wisconsin by 2. Wisconsin has a shot at the end of the game to tie it and send it to overtime. John Tonje ends up missing it, and BYU advances. So Alabama will take on BYU on Thursday at 6:09 p.m. Central Time. This game is going to be in the Prudential Center in New Jersey, and it will be an absolute electric matchup. Alabama and BYU, and one of the reporters asked Nate about this in the post game for St. Mary's. Alabama and BYU play a very similar style. Kevin Young has done a very good job with BYU of converting them to a much more pro style, NBA style system. Obviously, with their previous coach, Mark Pope, he was doing that as well. But this is a very Kentucky-esque team, right? When you look at where Mark Pope came from at BYU and the style that BYU runs and the style that Kentucky runs currently, very, very similar. Additionally, when you're looking at BYU and you look at the offense and defensive splits from a KenPom perspective, much better offensive team than defensive team, does not do a particularly great job at running teams off the three-point line, a very efficient offensive team, but again, a bit of a lackluster defensive team outside of defensive rebounding. That is something that, again, is very indicative of what we see with Kentucky, and that gives me a lot of hope as an Alabama fan because Kentucky is a team that Alabama has played incredibly well against 3 times this season, right? Obviously, there are different players on these rosters. They're not going to be the same exactly, but it is a very similar team in the sense that there are shooters all over the floor. They have a couple of big guys that can absolutely rebound the basketball, and it is going to be a team which, similar to Kentucky, if you do not guard, if you lose your matchup, they can make you pay from the three-point line. Right, BYU does a very good job shooting from deep. They're a team that scored 100 points at one point earlier this season. They're in the 90s quite a lot this season, and they have been a very good offensive team. Like I said, they are currently 9th in KenPom's offensive efficiency. They are 71st in defensive efficiency. For reference, if you look at Kentucky, which I know we just referenced, Kentucky is 11th and 45th. So a slightly worse offense, by just 2 points, or I guess by about half a point in 2 positions. And then Kentucky is actually a substantially better defense at 45th versus 70th. So that's what you're looking at when you're looking at these teams from an offense and defensive standpoint. Like I said, I look at this to be a very, very similar matchup to what you see. Again, the players are not going to be the same. I'm not expecting them to be, but that is what you're looking at when you look at these teams. A couple of notes and a couple of players that you really need to watch when you're looking at BYU and some players that Alabama is absolutely going to have to circle. First things first, their point guard. Igor Demon, 6'8", 6'9", very big point guard. 34th in the country in assist rate, does a really, really good job facilitating the offense, is a bit of a flashy passer, can make a lot of the passes on the basketball court, is only a 28% three-point shooter, but has the confidence. He stepped into a couple in the Wisconsin game and just absolutely nothing but net. He can be a confident three-point shooter, so he isn't somebody that you want to get hot, but he is somebody that is definitely a little bit more of a pass-first point guard that's trying to facilitate the offense and get his other guys that are much better shooters an open shot. They have two guys that are actually shooting over 43% from three, and Richie Saunders and Trevin Nell. Both guys, like I said, both guys over 43% from three, top 60 in the country in three-point percentage. They are guys that you absolutely cannot leave open. But even if you look at them, you have a guy like Dawson Baker that shoots 38% from three. Dalen Hall shoots 36%. Catchings shoots 35%. They have plenty of guys that can shoot and lace it from deep. So it is a team that you really have to pick your poison on if you're going to leave somebody open. And there are some guys that you absolutely cannot leave open, with three of them just shooting absolutely incredibly from deep. Then when you look on the inside, they have two main guys. They're smaller centers. They're fairly large body size, but they're fairly short. In Traore and Kibakita, both guys are very good rebounders. Traore, top 70 in offensive and top 100 in defensive rebounding. Kita top 10 in both, right? Kita is an incredibly, incredibly good rebounder on both sides of the floor. So both of those guys are guys that if you can get them in foul trouble early and get them off the floor so that you're not having to compete with them from a rebounding standpoint, that would be incredible because they are really the best two rebounders on the team, and without them, they are not a great rebounding team. So if you can get them in foul trouble, that would be awesome. But even if you can't, you really just have to fight for every rebound. You can't let the smaller guy kind of get under you, get the rebound. This is a game which I expect Mohamed Diabate to play a huge role in this game. Obviously, you need good Cliff in this game. The good thing about this is because they are a little bit smaller, they are not great in block rate. They're okay in blocks, but when you look at an Alabama team that goes to the rim a lot, sometimes if you have a team that's a very good shot blocking team, it can help neutralize Alabama if the guards are not making the correct decisions. Nate talks about if you're getting your shot blocked, you're not making the right decision, but unfortunately sometimes that is the case. This is a team where, because they're not as good of a shot blocking team, they don't have that height and that presence on the interior that can kind of erase a lot of mistakes. I would expect that if Alabama can get by some of their guys, they are going to be able to have some success in the interior. I would also think because of the way that BYU gambles at times, they do leave some guys open from three-point line. That was something I talked about up front, but they are 340th in the country, which is bottom 25 in the country at three-point field goal rate. So they give up a ton of three-point field goal attempts compared to just field goal attempts in general. About 45% of a team's shots against them end up being three-point attempts. And against a team like Alabama, if you don't run us off the three-point line, it can spell disaster. Obviously, Alabama has to shoot well, but with the number of shooters that Alabama has, not running us off the three-point line typically is not a recipe for success. So that is something that you're going to want to kind of watch. To their credit, BYU also does take quite a lot of threes, obviously, with the elite shooters that they have. So it's going to be something that Alabama's going to have to be successful in as well. I'm sure Alabama's going to try to run teams off the three-point line, funnel them down to Cliff, as we do in most cases. But I would be curious to see what happens. There's some matchups that I am very curious about. You look at a guy like LeBaron Philon matching up against Igor Dimon. I think that's going to be a really good matchup. I would expect that we give a guy like Philon to Dimon just due to the fact that Dimon has so much extra height on a guy like Mark Sears or Aiden Holloway. Also, just how shifty Dimon can be. I would expect Mark Sears on a guy probably like Trevin Nell. I think that's who you're going to have him on, or maybe Richie Saunders, one of the three-point shooters, and just have to tell Mark, hey, you have to stay attached. You have to fight through every screen because these guys, you cannot leave them open. And, if you leave them open, if you go under a screen instead of over, it's going to be a problem, right? So that's some of the key facts when you look at this game. This will be a hugely offensive game. I would expect the winner of this game to get into the 90-point range. It would not shock me if both teams got into 90 points in this game. I wouldn't expect it, but it wouldn't truly shock me. I do think that Alabama matches up pretty well with BYU. I talked about, that Kentucky matchup and being very similar because of the similarity in play style, the similarity in offensive skill talent, right? The guys that can just absolutely shoot incredibly well from deep and the way that you just can't leave guys. I think that Alabama has played a couple of teams this season, obviously Kentucky being one of them and some other teams in the SEC that can shoot so well from deep that I do think that Alabama is prepared for this matchup. I think that Alabama matches up, like I said, pretty well with BYU from that standpoint. I would be curious to see, for me to feel super comfortable in this game, I want to see good rebounding Cliff. I want to see good rebounding Mohamed Diabate because obviously even if Alabama matches up fairly well and forces the shots we want them to take, if we're losing the rebound battle in this game, it can be a long day, right? Even if Alabama is able to force the type of shots on offense and able to have them be a little bit more inefficient than what they're used to, it can be an issue when if you're giving up insane rebounds. And again, with them having two very elite rebounders, that is something that concerns me slightly. But like I said, I do think that Alabama will have success in this game. I am going to predict Alabama to win this one. I do think that Alabama having the guys that have made a run before, I think Alabama having proven, hey, this is what we're able to do. Honestly, I think that BYU being the hot thing right now, BYU is one of the hottest teams coming into the tournament. They're technically, per Bart Torvik, that does like a most recent rankings, they are technically a hotter team and a better ranked team than Alabama over the last couple. It's very, very close, but they are technically a better ranked team than Alabama. So I do think that when you look at what Alabama's seeing a lot of people say, well, Duke has this region completely locked up, or BYU potentially could knock off Alabama. I think that that's a situation where the team is going to take that to heart. I know Nate's been showing the players a lot of, hey, these guys don't believe in you type situations. I think that is something the team is going to take to heart. I think that's something that Alabama is going to play with. I expect another big game out of Cliff Amore when you have these smaller centers. Obviously, they can fight for rebounds and such, but I do think that the way that Alabama potentially is going to be able to play in pick and roll and able to get a free roller available with a guy like Cliff Amore, I do think that they're going to be able to have some success. I would expect this game to be much more in the higher possession range. Would not shock me if this game probably hits 75 to 78 possessions if I was guessing, because Alabama and BYU are both going to be very content running with the basketball when they get a rebound or a made shot. So obviously Alabama's transition defense is going to have to be as good as it has been at times this season. You can't have a game like North Carolina when you're giving up a lot of stuff in transition. But I do think that Alabama has the guys and has the skill talent to be successful in this game. I think that Alabama wins it. I think that Alabama wins it by a score of, I'm going to go 93 to 86. I think that is going to be a pretty close game. I think that Alabama maybe pulls away near the end with some free throws as BYU tries to lengthen the game. But I do think that Alabama can win this game and move on to just their third Elite Eight in school history. Like I said, if Alabama does win this game, I will be recording an episode on Friday, which will come out so that you can watch in advance of my preview for the Saturday game. As always, if you're curious about my player-by-player breakdowns, those happen before the morning of every game. Those come out on Twitter. So follow me over on Twitter. Those threads are going to come out. I will break down the game in its entirety. I will give player-by-player breakdowns. I will give my player to watch for Alabama. And I will give, hey, what I think this game is going to look like from an overall perspective. Obviously, I've given my prediction here. It probably will be the same prediction in that thread if I don't change my mind. But it will be a little bit more player by player and what I think about this game as a whole, right? So if you are interested in those, follow me over on Twitter. I would appreciate it. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. I really do appreciate the support on the podcast, and I will catch you in the next episode. Peace.